The ambulance sirens wailed through the mountain mist as Dr. Lucia Reyes sprinted across the hospital parking lot, her white coat streaming behind her like wings. Inside the emergency bay, chaos erupted as a logging accident had brought in 7 critically injured workers, their lives hanging by threads thinner than the morning fog that cloaked Riverside Falls, Oregon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What the other doctors and nurses didn't know as they watched. Lucia worked with supernatural precision, her hands moving through trauma procedures like she was conducting a deadly symphony. Was that those same hands had once piloted a medical evacuation helicopter through enemy fire in 3 different war zones. They didn't know that the woman who now saved lives in a quiet mountain clinic had once been Captain Sofia Phoenix Reyes, the most decorated combat medic pilot in military history. They especially didn't know that 10 years ago she had walked into her commanding officer's tent, thrown her flight suit and medals on his desk, and said 5 words that would haunt her forever: "I refuse to fly again." The first light of dawn painted the Cascade Mountains in shades of amber and rose as Lucia Reyes stepped onto the porch of the Riverside Falls Medical Clinic. She carried her coffee in a ceramic mug that read, "World's Okayest Doctor, a gift from the town's children," after she'd spent 3 days straight treating them during a flu outbreak 2 winters ago. The mug was chipped at the handle, worn smooth by countless mornings just like this one, and it felt like home in her hands. Riverside Falls wasn't the kind of place that appeared on tourist maps or travel brochures. Nestled in a valley where the Clearwater River carved its way between towering Douglas firs and ancient cedars, the town existed in a perpetual state of almost forgotten. Population 2,847, according to the weathered sign at the town limits, though Lucia suspected the actual number was closer to 2,600. If you didn't count the seasonal workers who drifted through during logging season. The clinic itself was a converted Victorian house that had been built in 1892 by a railroad baron who'd never actually visited the town he'd helped establish. 3 stories of gingerbread trim and bay windows that now housed examination rooms, a small surgical suite, and Lucia's private apartment on the 3rd floor. The building had character, which was the polite way of saying the heating system had moods, and the plumbing made sounds like an angry wail when the weather turned cold. For 8 years, this had been her entire world. Dr. Lucia Reyes, general practitioner, emergency medicine specialist, and the only physician within 100 miles who could perform surgery more complex than removing splinters. She delivered babies, set broken bones, treated everything from bee stings to heart attacks, and maintained the careful fiction that she'd spent her 20s in medical school and residency programs at perfectly ordinary hospitals in perfectly ordinary cities. The people of Riverside Falls had accepted her without question, the way small towns embrace anyone willing to fill a desperate need. The previous doctor had retired to Florida, leaving behind a community that was too remote for most physicians, and too poor to attract the kind of medical professionals who expected 6-figure salaries and country club memberships. When Lucia had arrived with her medical credentials and her offer to work for whatever the town could afford to pay, they'd handed her the keys to the clinic and asked no questions about why someone with her qualifications would choose to practice in the middle of nowhere. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that her medical degree was real, but her past was carefully constructed fiction. The woman who checked their blood pressure and prescribed antibiotics for their children's ear infections had learned trauma medicine in field hospitals, where mortar rounds shook the walls and the electricity came from diesel generators that ran on borrowed time. She'd performed surgery by flashlight, delivered babies in the back of armored vehicles, and saved more lives before her 30th birthday than most doctors managed in entire careers. Lucia unlocked the clinic's front door and disabled the security system with movements that were automatic after 8 years of routine. The lobby smelled like antiseptic and the lavender air freshener that Mrs. Chun insisted on spraying everywhere, creating an oddly comforting combination that somehow represented everything good about small-town medicine. Framed photographs of patients lined the walls, newborn babies, wedding pictures from couples she'd helped through fertility struggles, graduation photos from kids she'd patched up after bicycle accidents and playground mishaps. The examination rooms were equipped with standard medical equipment, most of it donated by the state health department or purchased through medical charity organizations. But in the supply closet behind boxes of gauze and disposable syringes, hidden in a locked cabinet that appeared to contain nothing more interesting than outdated medical journals, Lucia kept equipment that didn't belong in a rural clinic. Advanced trauma supplies, medications that required federal permits to possess, and surgical instruments that were typically found only in major trauma centers. Every morning, she performed the same ritual, coffee first, then a walk through each room to check supplies and equipment, followed by a review of the day's scheduled appointments. This Tuesday morning promised to be routine: wellness checkups for 3 elderly patients, a follow-up visit for a logger whose chainsaw had gotten too close to his leg the previous month, and a consultation with Janet Morrison about her chronic back pain that everyone in town knew was really chronic worry about her husband's drinking. The radio on her desk crackled with the morning weather report. A storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing heavy rain and winds that would make driving treacherous on the mountain roads. She made a mental note to call the Morrison farm and suggest they reschedule if the weather turned too rough for Janet to make the 20-mile drive into town. At exactly 7:30, Frank Moreau knocked on the clinic's back door, carrying a paper bag that contained 2 blueberry muffins and a thermos of coffee that was significantly better than anything Lucia could make herself. Frank owned Moreau's Diner, an establishment that served as the town's unofficial community center, news distribution hub, and general gathering place for anyone who wanted to know what was happening in Riverside Falls. "Morning, Doc," Frank said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair beside her desk. At 65, Frank had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades listening to other people's problems while serving coffee and comfort food. "Thought you might want to hear about the excitement we had last night." Lucia accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Frank's definition of excitement usually involved nothing more dramatic than someone's cow getting loose or teenagers spray painting the water tower. "What kind of excitement?" "Helicopter flew over around 2 in the morning," Frank said, his eyes bright with the particular enthusiasm that small-town residents reserved for anything that disrupted their normal routine. "Big one, military-looking. Flew low enough to rattle windows, then disappeared somewhere up in the national forest." Lucia's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Military helicopters didn't accidentally wander over remote Oregon towns, especially not at 2 in the morning when legitimate training exercises would be grounded due to weather conditions. "Did anyone else see it?" Bill Henderson was coming home from his shift at the lumber mill, said it looked like one of those big transport birds, no lights, flying dark. Frank leaned forward conspiratorially. "You don't suppose we've got some kind of military exercise going on up there, do you? I mean, what else would bring a chopper like that into the middle of nowhere?" Lucia forced her expression to remain calm, professional, mildly interested, but not concerned. It was an expression she'd perfected over 8 years of hiding in plain sight, a mask that said she was exactly what she appeared to be, a small-town doctor whose biggest concern was making sure the clinic had enough flu vaccine for the coming winter. Probably just a training flight that got off course, she said, though every instinct she'd developed during her military years was screaming that nothing about this was routine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The weather's been unpredictable lately," Frank accepted this explanation with the easy trust that small-town residents extended to their doctor. If Doc Reyes wasn't worried, then there was probably nothing to worry about. He finished his coffee and headed back to the diner to open for the breakfast crowd, leaving Lucia alone with her thoughts and a growing sense that her carefully constructed, peaceful life was about to become complicated. The morning passed quietly. Mrs. Patterson came in for her blood pressure medication, spending 20 minutes discussing her grandson's baseball prospects and her concerns about young people spending too much time on their phones. Tom Bradley brought his daughter in for a wellness checkup before the school year started, and Lucia found herself genuinely enjoying their conversation about the girl's plans to study veterinary medicine. These were the moments that reminded her why she'd chosen this life. In Riverside Falls, medicine was personal. She wasn't treating case numbers or insurance claims. She was caring for people she saw at the grocery store, whose children she'd helped bring into the world, whose families had become part of her chosen community. It was healing in a way that went beyond the physical, a kind of medicine that mended something in her own soul that had been broken by too many wars and too many impossible choices. Just after noon, as she was finishing her notes from the morning appointments, the clinic's phone rang. The caller ID showed an out-of-state number with an area code she didn't recognize, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes patients who'd moved away called for medical records or prescription refills. Riverside Falls Medical Clinic, this is Dr. Reyes. The voice that answered was professional, crisp, with the particular tone that government employees used when they were being official. Dr. Reyes, this is Agent Patricia Wells with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm calling regarding a potential emergency medical situation that may require your expertise. Lucia's grip tightened on the phone. FEMA didn't call rural clinics unless something catastrophic was happening, and the timing felt too coincidental given Frank's story about midnight helicopters. What kind of emergency? There's been an incident involving a research facility in the National Forest area near your location. Multiple casualties, complex medical needs that may exceed local hospital capabilities. We understand you have extensive trauma experience. The carefully constructed fiction of her background included a residency in emergency medicine at a Portland hospital and volunteer work with medical relief organizations. It was a plausible explanation for advanced trauma skills that wouldn't raise questions in a small town. But Agent Wells' phrasing suggested knowledge that went beyond what was in her official medical credentials. I'm not sure how I can help, Lucia said carefully. The nearest hospital with full trauma capabilities is in Eugene, about 2 hours away. If you're dealing with serious casualties, you'd want to evacuate them there or to Portland. The situation is complicated by the remote location and weather conditions. Helicopter evacuation isn't currently possible, and ground transport would take too long for the most critical patients. We need someone with advanced trauma experience who can provide stabilizing care until evacuation becomes feasible. Lucia looked out the clinic's window at the gathering storm clouds. The rain had started as a light drizzle, but the wind was picking up, bending the trees in ways that suggested conditions would deteriorate rapidly. If there really were injured people trapped in the mountains, time was running out for any kind of rescue operation. How many casualties are we talking about? Initial reports indicate 15 to 20 individuals with varying degrees of injury. At least 6 are considered critical. Agent Wells paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that suggested this wasn't just another bureaucratic call. Dr. Reyes, I need to be direct with you. The research facility was conducting classified work, and the individuals involved are federal employees whose safety is a matter of national importance. We're asking for your help not just as a physician, but as someone who understands the complexities of working in challenging environments. The last sentence felt like a test, a carefully worded probe to see how she would respond. Lucia stared at her reflection in the clinic's window. seeing not the small-town doctor she'd become, but the shadows of the woman she used to be. The woman who could land a medical helicopter in impossible conditions, who could perform surgery while under fire, who had saved hundreds of lives before she'd finally reached her breaking point and walked away from it all. Agent Wells, I appreciate the situation you're describing, but I'm not equipped to handle mass casualties. I run a small clinic with basic equipment. What you're describing sounds like it requires a trauma team and a fully equipped hospital. We understand your limitations, Doctor. We're not asking you to perform miracles. We're asking you to do what you can to keep people alive until we can get them to proper facilities. Sometimes that's all the difference between life and death. Through the window, Lucia could see Frank Moreau's diner across the street, where the Tuesday lunch crowd was probably discussing the weather and complaining about the government and arguing about whether the high school football team had any chance of making the playoffs this year. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that somewhere in the mountains, people were dying while she stood in her comfortable clinic, trying to decide whether to reveal skills that she'd spent 8 years hiding. I need more details, Lucia heard herself say. Location, injury specifics, and what kind of support you're offering. A team will be there within the hour to brief you in full. Dr. Reyes, your government values your willingness to assist. In this situation. When the call ended, Lucia stood in her quiet clinic, listening as the rain lashed harder against the windows. In just 1 hour, people would arrive, people who knew secrets about her that no one in Riverside Falls even suspected. They were going to ask her to become someone she'd worked hard to stop being, to use skills she'd buried for nearly a decade. But people were in danger, somewhere out in the mountains. And no matter how far she'd run, no matter why she had walked away from her former life, Lucia Reyes was still a doctor. And that meant when lives were on the line, she couldn't turn her back. She locked the clinic's door, flipped the sign to closed for emergency, and climbed the stairs to her apartment. Hidden in a closet behind old coats were cases she'd kept sealed for years, gear from her past life, advanced medical tools, comms equipment, and flight gear tailored for high-risk rescues. As she changed into weather-appropriate gear, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For a split second, she didn't see the small-town doctor who grew herbs and knew every patient by name. She saw Captain Sofia Phoenix Reyes, the elite pilot, and field medic who once flew into war zones, who had never lost a patient, and who had finally broken under the weight of it all. Outside, the storm worsened, and deep in the forest, people were waiting for help that only she could give. The SUVs rolled in 57 minutes after the call, black and quiet, slicing through the mountain stillness. From her apartment window, Lucia watched the 3 government vehicles park. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, clearly not ordinary emergency workers. She descended with a deceptively normal-looking medical kit, its contents worth more than most hospitals, and unlocked the door with calm, precise hands. Her heart beat in the familiar rhythm of combat, elevated, alert, focused. Agent Patricia Wells emerged first, and Lucia immediately recognized the type. This wasn't your average FEMA rep. Wells moved like someone used to danger and decisions that cost lives. Mid-40s, gray hair tied back, practical clothes, everything about her screamed experience in the field. Dr. Reyes, thank you for stepping in, Wells said, offering a calloused hand Lucia recognized from rappelling and weapon handling. Things have gotten worse since we spoke. 5 others followed, introducing themselves with first names only. Marcus, the comms expert with equipment far beyond civilian grade. Elena, logistics with the bearing of ex-military. James, a medical tech with restricted surgical gear. Catherine, a weather specialist tracking live satellite data. And David, the team lead, whose handshake told Lucia he knew who she really was. David Kim, about 38, had the sharp focus of someone used to leading in crisis. When he looked at her, Lucia knew he saw not just Dr. Reyes, but Captain Reyes too. "Dr. Reyes, we're working against the clock," he said. "The weather's closing in, and lives are at risk." They laid out a map on the clinic's front desk. Lucia saw the location deep within Cascade National Forest. No roads, barely passable trails, and worsening conditions. Elena pointed. "The site is the Pacific Northwest Research Station, or so it's called publicly. In truth, it supports classified defense-related environmental research." Wells showed her satellite imagery of a hidden compound beneath forest cover. "At 1400 yesterday, a lab explosion occurred. We believe it was an equipment failure, but confirmation will require boots on the ground." Lucia's mind automatically went into triage mode. "Casualties? What's their condition?" "Total of 18 on site at the time," David said. "We last spoke to their medic about 6 hours ago, but comms are spotty. He reported 7 critically injured, severe burns, internal injuries, spinal trauma." Marcus was already setting up high-grade comms gear, well beyond FEMA standard. "They have a basic clinic and a paramedic, but that's nowhere near enough for this. What about air evac?" Lucia asked, already bracing for bad news. Catherine glanced at her readings. "Winds up to 45 knots, near zero visibility, worsening. Fast, we're grounded for at least 12 hours. Then Wells leaned in, voice low and serious, the tone used for classified info. "Dr. Reyes, I need to share information with you that's above the clearance level of most of the people in this room. The research being conducted at that facility involves atmospheric manipulation technology that has implications for national defense. The personnel trapped there include scientists whose knowledge is considered vital to national security." Lucia felt the familiar chill of recognition. She'd heard similar briefings before, had been part of missions where the strategic value of human assets outweighed normal risk assessment protocols. "You're saying this isn't just a rescue mission?" "I'm saying that failure to extract these individuals could compromise projects that have taken decades to develop and billions of dollars to fund," Wells replied. "More importantly, some of the injured personnel have been exposed to experimental compounds that require specialized medical treatment. Without proper intervention, they will die." David spread additional maps showing the logging roads and hiking trails that provided access to the facility. "The closest we can get by vehicle is here, about 8 miles from the target location. From that point, it's foot travel over terrain that becomes increasingly difficult as you approach the facility." James, the medical technician, opened cases that revealed equipment Lucia hadn't seen since her military days: portable surgical units, advanced trauma supplies, and medications that were restricted to military and high-level government use. "We can carry enough medical equipment to establish a field hospital, but we need someone with the expertise to use it effectively under combat conditions." The phrase "combat conditions" hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Lucia looked around the room at faces that were carefully neutral, people who were pretending not to notice that they'd just revealed knowledge about her background that wasn't included in any civilian medical credentials. "Agent Wells," Lucia said carefully, "I think we need to discuss exactly how much you know about my qualifications for this mission." Wells nodded to the others, who began packing their equipment with the efficient movements of people who were accustomed to rapid deployment. When the room had cleared, except for Wells and David, the agent pulled out a file that was marked with security classifications Lucia hadn't seen in 8 years. "Captain Sofia Phoenix Reyes," Wells read from the file. "Phantom Wing Medical Evacuation. Specialist, qualified on UH-60 Black Hawk and UH-72 Lakota helicopters. Holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 Purple Hearts. Responsible for successful medical evacuation of over 400 personnel from hostile environments across 3 combat theaters." Lucia's jaw tightened as Wells continued reading from records that were supposed to have been sealed and classified beyond civilian access. specialized in high-risk extractions under fire, including the rescue of scientific personnel from compromised research facilities in Afghanistan and Syria. Credited with developing medical stabilization techniques that are now standard protocol for military emergency medicine. David closed the door to the clinic's waiting room and activated a device that would prevent electronic surveillance. Dr. Reyes, we know you left the military under circumstances that were classified at the highest levels. We also know that you've spent 8 years trying to disappear from the life you used to live. What we don't know, Wells continued, is whether you're willing to become Phoenix one more time to save people who can't save themselves. Lucia walked to the window and stared out at the storm that was turning the afternoon sky the color of old pewter. Rain lashed against the glass with increasing intensity, and she could see trees bending under wind that would make helicopter operations suicidal for any pilot who valued their life over their mission parameters. The last time I flew a medical evacuation, 3 good people died because I followed orders from people who cared more about political outcomes than human lives, she said quietly. I threw my uniform away because I realized I'd become part of a machine that consumed the people it was supposed to protect. David moved to stand beside her, his voice carrying understanding that came from shared experience. I know what happened in Syria, Phoenix. I was there when you brought out Dr. Martinez and his research team. I saw what you did to save those people, and I saw what it cost you. Lucia turned to face him, studying features that seemed familiar despite 8 years of separation. David Kim, you were the medic on the extraction team. You helped me carry Martinez to the helicopter after he'd been shot. That's right. And I also saw you fly that Black Hawk through a sandstorm with 0 visibility and hostile fire from 3 directions because you refused to leave wounded people behind. You saved Martinez's life, and his atmospheric research data prevented a chemical weapons attack that would have killed thousands of civilians. The memory hit Lucia like a physical blow. She could still smell the cordite and burning fuel, could still feel the helicopter bucking against winds that threatened to slam them into mountainous terrain. Dr. Martinez had been dying from blood loss. His research team was trapped in a facility that was about to be overrun, and the politicians had wanted to classify the mission as expendable rather than risk additional resources on a rescue that had already gone wrong. She disobeyed direct orders to abort the mission, had flown into conditions that military protocols classified as unsurvivable, and had somehow managed to extract 7 people who would have died if she'd followed the safe, politically acceptable course of action. 3 weeks later, she discovered that the intelligence justifying the mission had been fabricated, that the research they'd risked everything to protect had been sold to defense contractors who'd made billions while the soldiers who'd saved it received commendations and transfer orders to even more dangerous assignments. Martinez's research prevented a chemical attack, she said, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. But the same technology was used to develop weapons that killed civilians in 3 different countries. The people I saved became part of a system that created more death than it prevented. Wells closed the classified file and placed it carefully in her briefcase. Dr. Reyes, I understand your concerns about being used by systems that prioritize political outcomes over human welfare. But right now, 18 people are trapped in a facility that's collapsing around them, and they're going to die unless someone with your skills helps them. You're asking me to become someone I spent 8 years trying to forget. I'm asking you to save lives, David said simply. No politics, no classified agendas, no strategic objectives beyond getting injured people to safety. Just medicine, just rescue, just the oath you took to do no harm. Lucia looked around the clinic that had become her sanctuary, her chosen life, her carefully constructed refuge from the complexities of a world where saving 1 life often meant enabling 10 deaths. On the walls were photographs of children she'd delivered, families she'd helped heal, a community that had accepted her without questions or conditions. But somewhere in the mountains, people were dying while she stood in her comfortable clinic, trying to decide whether she could trust herself to use skills that came with consequences she'd never been able to escape. "If I do this," she said finally, "I go as Dr. Lucia Reyes, civilian physician volunteering to help with an emergency. Not as Phoenix, not as anyone connected to military operations or classified programs. Just a doctor trying to save lives." Wells nodded, understanding the distinction that meant everything to Lucia's sense of identity. "Agreed. This is a civilian medical emergency response, nothing more." David activated his communications equipment and began coordinating with the team members who were loading supplies into all-terrain vehicles designed for mountain rescue operations. "We leave in 20 minutes. Dr. Reyes, I need you to know that once we're on site, I'll follow your medical authority without question. You're the lead physician on this mission." As Lucia gathered her personal medical equipment and prepared to leave the safety of her clinic, she caught her reflection in the window one more time. The woman looking back wasn't quite Dr. Reyes anymore, but she wasn't Phoenix either. She was something new, someone who carried the skills of her past but answered to her own moral authority, rather than to systems that treated human lives as acceptable losses in larger strategic games. Outside, the storm was reaching its full intensity, turning the world into a chaos of wind and rain that would challenge every skill she'd ever learned. But 18 people were depending on her ability to navigate that chaos and bring them safely home. And regardless of what she'd walked away from or why she'd chosen to disappear, she was still a doctor. The vehicles pulled away from the clinic in convoy formation, their headlights cutting through weather that was rapidly approaching the limits of safe travel. As they climbed into the mountains on roads that became increasingly treacherous with each mile, Lucia realized that the quiet life she'd built in Riverside Falls was already behind her, separated by choices that couldn't be undone and skills that couldn't be unlearned. The past she'd tried so hard to escape was rising around her like the storm outside, and she suspected that by the time this mission ended, she would have to choose once again between the person she'd been and the person she wanted to become. The difference was that this time, she would make that choice on her own terms, guided by her own conscience rather than by orders from people who viewed human lives as resources to be expended in service of larger objectives. But first, she had to get through the next 24 hours without losing anyone who could still be saved. The all-terrain vehicles climbed through switchbacks that seemed designed to test both mechanical engineering and human courage. Lucia gripped the passenger door handle as their driver, Elena, navigated curves that dropped away into darkness on one side and rose into sheer rock faces on the other. The headlights carved tunnels through rain that had intensified beyond anything the Weather Service had predicted, and the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against water that seemed to be falling sideways. Behind them, the other two vehicles maintained precise following distances, their drivers demonstrating the kind of skill that came from training in hostile environments. Through the rear window, Lucia could see David coordinating with his team, using hand signals that suggested they were maintaining radio silence for reasons that hadn't been explained. After 90 minutes of climbing roads that seemed to lead nowhere, Elena pulled into a cleared area that served as the trailhead for hiking routes deeper into the national forest. The vehicles formed a defensive circle, and the team began unloading equipment with efficiency that spoke of countless similar operations. Waterproof cases containing medical supplies, communications gear, and specialized equipment that Lucia couldn't identify emerged from hidden compartments built into the vehicle's cargo areas. Agent Wells approached carrying a tactical radio and a satellite communicator that represented technology several generations beyond anything available to civilian emergency services. "Dr. Reyes, we've re-established contact with the facility. The situation has deteriorated significantly since our last communication. David activated a portable computer terminal that projected a three-dimensional map of their route to the research facility. The path wound through terrain that would be challenging for experienced hikers in good weather and potentially lethal in the current conditions. The medical officer reports that 2 of the critical patients have gone into shock, and they're running out of supplies to maintain the others. We have maybe 6 hours before we start losing people. Lucia studied the topographical display, her mind automatically calculating travel times, equipment loads, and medical requirements. 8 miles of mountain hiking in storm conditions with enough medical equipment to establish a field hospital meant they were looking at 4 to 5 hours of travel time, assuming they didn't encounter obstacles that forced route modifications. "What kind of injuries are we dealing with specifically?" she asked, pulling on the waterproof jacket that Elena had provided from their emergency supplies. Marcus consulted a tablet that displayed real-time updates from the facility's emergency coordinator. Burns from chemical exposure affecting approximately 40% of total body surface area for 2 patients. Possible internal injuries from blast trauma for 3 others. Spinal compression injuries for 2 individuals who were caught in structural collapse, and various degrees of smoke inhalation and toxic exposure for the remaining personnel. The medical complexity of the situation became clear as Lucia absorbed the details. She wasn't just looking at trauma injuries that could be stabilized with standard emergency procedures. Chemical burns required specialized treatment protocols. Spinal injuries needed immobilization techniques that were difficult to maintain during evacuation, and toxic exposure could result in systemic organ failure that would require capabilities beyond what they could carry. James opened the medical supply cases, revealing equipment that represented millions of dollars in advanced trauma care technology. Portable ventilators, specialized burn treatment systems, spinal immobilization devices, and pharmaceutical supplies. That included medications restricted to military and research applications. "We can establish a complete trauma unit on site, but someone needs to coordinate the medical protocols." Catherine, the weather expert, approached with grim news. "The storm's intensifying beyond our projections, steady winds at 60 knots, gusts up to 80. Ground travel will be impossible in about 8 hours, and helicopters won't be able to fly in or out for at least 18 hours after that." Agent Wells gathered everyone around the topographical map, her face etched with urgency. "We have one shot at reaching the facility, stabilizing the injured, and setting up an evacuation plan before the weather locks us out. If we miss this window, people die." David began handing out high-level gear, night vision goggles, GPS trackers, emergency communication units, and survival packs built for extreme conditions. "Dr. Reyes, you're in charge of medical operations at this site. I'll coordinate tactics and evac plans. Elena handles supplies. Marcus is our link to outside support. Catherine monitors the weather, and James assists you medically." As they prepared to begin the trek into terrain military manuals would call non-survivable, Lucia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a rescue mission. The equipment was too advanced, the precision too sharp. The team operated like a covert unit. It had all the hallmarks of a classified military extraction, not a typical emergency response. Lucia turned to Agent Wells, voice low. "This isn't just about environmental research. These people aren't just scientists. What's really going on?" Wells checked her watch, calculating how long they had before the weather made the mission impossible. "The Pacific Northwest Research Station is conducting experimental work in atmospheric manipulation. It has the potential to completely reshape how we predict and control weather, transformative for agriculture, disaster response, even reversing climate damage." "But it's dual use," Lucia replied, drawing from her military background. "If someone wanted to, they could use it as a weapon. Redirect a hurricane, create a drought, destroy crops in enemy countries." David, now geared up and ready to lead, confirmed her fear. The team we're rescuing includes the lead scientists behind years of top-secret atmospheric engineering. Billions have been invested. If their data or they themselves fall into the wrong hands, the global balance of power could shift. A familiar knot twisted in Lucia's gut. This was the kind of ethical quagmire that had driven her out of military life. Once again, she was being asked to put herself on the line for a cause that walked a moral tightrope. But regardless of the politics or the potential for abuse, there were people trapped, injured, and dying. Her job was to save lives, not judge what those lives had created. "Let's go," she said quietly, lifting her gear and following David into the storm-darkened forest. The trail ahead wasn't meant for what they were carrying. It was a hiking path, not a rescue route. Within 20 minutes, they were climbing sharp switchbacks that made breathing difficult and talking impossible. Lucia slipped into the mindset she knew from combat zones: move with purpose, stay aware, conserve energy. The night vision goggles revealed a transformed alien landscape. Trees bent under the wind, some cracking. Water poured down rocks that had turned into makeshift waterfalls. Parts of the trail were submerged in streams that hadn't existed a day earlier. Behind her, the team moved in a tight but staggered formation, close enough for support, far enough to minimize risk from falling debris or accidents. Elena tracked their location in real time. Marcus managed the communications link, and Catherine monitored the storm's evolution. 2 hours in, they reached a narrow plateau shielded from the worst of the wind. David called a stop to check gear and assess their status. Lucia used the pause to try to reach the facility. "Pacific Research Station, this is Dr. Lucia Reyes, emergency medical team inbound. What's your current status?" A strained voice responded, exhausted, desperate. "This is Paramedic Thompson. We lost 2 more in the last hour. I've got 3 others who won't make it through the night without surgery." Lucia activated her recorder. "I need full details. Start with the worst cases. Patient alpha female 34 has chemical, burns over roughly 45% of her body, including airway damage from inhalation. She's on fluids and pain meds, but I can't do much more. She needs burn specialists." He continued, listing injuries that sounded like a battlefield report: massive internal bleeding, spinal trauma from collapsing structures, toxic exposure, leading to respiratory failure, burns from unknown chemicals that weren't responding to typical treatments. Patient Echo is Dr. Sarah Martinez, our lead physicist. She was in the main lab when the explosion hit. Severe head trauma, possible skull fracture, unconscious for the past 3 hours. I'm monitoring vital signs, but she needs immediate neurological assessment. Lucia felt recognition like cold water in her veins. Dr. Sarah Martinez was the daughter of Dr. Roberto Martinez, the atmospheric researcher she'd evacuated from Syria 8 years ago. The mission that had ended her military career and driven her into hiding was reaching across time to pull her back into a world she'd tried desperately to escape. David noticed her reaction to the name and activated his secure communication device. "Dr. Reyes, is there something about Dr. Martinez that I need to know?" Her father was Dr. Roberto Martinez, the atmospheric researcher we evacuated from the Syrian facility in 2016. Mission that went wrong and ended with 3 casualties. Lucia stared into the storm, remembering faces of people who had died because of decisions made by officials who cared more about political outcomes than human lives. She was 19 then, just starting graduate school. Her father used to carry her photograph in his wallet. Agent Wells activated her own communication equipment and began transmitting information that Lucia couldn't hear over the wind. After several minutes of encrypted conversation, she approached with an expression that suggested the situation had become even more complicated. "Dr. Reyes, there's something else you need to know about this mission. 3 hours ago, we intercepted intelligence indicating that foreign agents are aware of the research, facility's location, and the nature of work being conducted there. They may already be en route to the facility. The implications hit Lucia like a physical blow. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a race against hostile forces who wanted to capture both the researchers and their work. The atmospheric manipulation technology that could be used for beneficial purposes could also be weaponized by organizations that had no interest in environmental restoration or agricultural improvement. Marcus consulted his tactical communication device and reported information that made their situation even more urgent. Satellite surveillance shows unidentified aircraft crossing into U.S. airspace from the north, flight path consistent with insertion of personnel near the research facility. Estimated arrival time puts them on site within 6 hours. David gathered the team around the map display, his expression reflecting the military planning mindset that separated professionals from amateurs. We now have multiple objectives: reach the facility before hostile forces arrive, provide medical stabilization for critical casualties, secure the research data and personnel, and establish evacuation procedures before weather conditions become completely impossible. Lucia realized that she was no longer participating in a humanitarian rescue mission. She was part of a classified operation to prevent sensitive technology from falling into hostile hands, and the medical emergency was only one component of a larger strategic objective. Once again, she found herself caught between her oath to save lives and her unwillingness to become part of systems that prioritize political objectives over human welfare. Agent Wells, I need to be clear about something. I came on this mission to provide medical care to injured people, not to participate in intelligence operations or technology protection schemes. My responsibility is to the patients, not to government. Research projects. Wells checked her watch and calculated the time remaining before multiple deadlines converged. Dr. Reyes, your primary responsibility is medical care, and will support that mission completely. But if hostile forces capture the facility, those patients become prisoners rather than people you can help. Our objectives are aligned. Get the people out safely before the situation becomes impossible. As they prepared to resume the climb toward a facility where injured people waited for help that might arrive too late, Lucia understood that she was walking back into the kind of moral complexity that had driven her away from military service. The difference was that this time, she would maintain her own ethical priorities regardless of what larger objectives other people might have. But first, she had to reach Dr. Sarah Martinez and 17 other people whose lives depended on her ability to navigate terrain, weather, and political complications that seemed designed to prevent success. The storm was intensifying, hostile forces were approaching, and time was running out for everyone involved. The trail ahead disappeared into darkness that concealed both salvation and disaster, and Lucia followed David deeper into mountains that had become a battlefield where the stakes were measured in human lives and global power balances. The research facility emerged from the forest darkness like a wound in the earth, its buildings half collapsed and surrounded by the acrid smell of chemical fires that rain couldn't fully extinguish. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through smoke that drifted between structures designed to be invisible from satellite surveillance, and the sound of generators struggling to maintain power created a mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Lucia followed David through a security perimeter that had been hastily established around the main complex, noting defensive positions that suggested the facility's personnel had training beyond atmospheric research. Paramedic Thompson met them at what remained of the main laboratory building, his medical uniform stained with blood and chemical residue that told the story of 6 hours spent fighting to keep people alive with insufficient resources. Dr. Reyes, thank God you made it, Thompson said, leading them through corridors where emergency lighting revealed damage that went far beyond simple equipment malfunction. Walls showed blast patterns consistent with explosive devices, and the destruction was too systematic to be accidental. The critical patients are in the emergency shelter. We've lost 3 people since I last contacted you. The emergency shelter, carved directly into the mountainside behind the main facility, had been built to protect personnel and critical equipment from both natural disasters and potential attacks. Inside, portable medical systems struggled to keep 15 patients alive under conditions that strained every known rule of emergency medicine. The air was thick with antiseptic and the heavy, silent tension of people trying to survive. Dr. Sarah Martinez lay unconscious on a field cot, her head wrapped in bandages that only partly concealed the extent of her injuries. Even in the dim light, Lucia could see her resemblance to Roberto Martinez, her father, and one of the most respected atmospheric physicists of his time. Sarah had inherited his sharp features and intellect, but unlike his academic poise, her presence suggested a relentless drive, someone who carried both brilliance and the weight of world-altering work. "What's her neurological status?" Lucia asked, immediately shifting into triage mode. Thompson, the facility's paramedic, checked data on a rugged waterproof tablet. She scored an 8 on the Glasgow Coma Scale when she lost consciousness, down to 6 now. Pupils are sluggish but responsive. I don't have the tools to assess internal cranial bleeding. Lucia powered on the diagnostic tools. James had hauled through miles of rough terrain military-grade tech adapted for disaster zones. The scans showed serious but manageable injuries, a subdural hematoma pressing on brain tissue, facial fractures from the explosion, and chemical irritation in the lungs that hadn't caused permanent damage. She needs immediate decompression to relieve the brain pressure, Lucia said, prepping the surgical field. We can do it here, but she needs full hospital care after. David was already coordinating with the extraction team via encrypted comms, but his expression told Lucia something else was now complicating the situation. "Dr. Reyes," he said grimly, "satellite surveillance just flagged several vehicles approaching from the northern road. Estimated arrival, 90 minutes. Agent Wells stepped in from a secure wing of the facility, her arms full of hard drives and classified documents. They're not friendlies. Intelligence confirms foreign operatives, likely sent to secure both personnel and research data." Lucia's heart sank. This was all too familiar. She'd been in this kind of no-win situation before, treating the wounded under threat of enemy action, with lives at stake and politics creeping in. But this time, she knew where she stood. "Agent Wells," Lucia said calmly but firmly, "my job is saving lives. Dr. Martinez needs surgery, and the other critical patients need stabilization. That comes before anything else, even your classified intel." Wells checked her tablet, which displayed real-time updates from surveillance drones. "Understood, but if those operatives breach this facility, your patients will become assets captured, not rescued. We have to defend this place while you work." David and his team moved quickly to set up defensive positions around the medical shelter. It was clear now. This was more than just a medical emergency. It was a battlefield. "How long do you need?" David asked her, not impatient, just planning. Lucia did the math. 45 minutes for the brain surgery. Another hour for wound care on the burn victims. And spinal injury patients need careful immobilization rushing that could paralyze them for life. Marcus tapped into communication channels, his equipment flashing indicators far too advanced for typical emergency response. "Helicopters are prepped but can't fly until the storm clears 3 hours at minimum. Ground evac is possible, but only with secure transport and cover fire." Elena studied tactical terrain data maps not found on any civilian GPS. "We can hold them off, but not for long. We have maybe 2 hours max to stabilize and move out." Lucia turned back to her patient, donning surgical gloves. This was no longer just about science or storms. The level of security, the secrecy, the precision all pointed to something much bigger, research with military-grade consequences. As the portable surgical kit sprang to life, mimicking the precision of a real operating room, Lucia focused on relieving the pressure inside Dr. Martinez's skull. The work was delicate, exacting, and as she operated, her mind lingered on one question: what kind of atmospheric research was so valuable it warranted this level of protection? Thompson, by her side, continued monitoring the others. His skills sharp. Efficient suggested training well beyond a typical paramedic. "Dr. Reyes," he said urgently. "Patient in bed 7, respiratory distress. Chemical exposure symptoms are escalating. Whatever they were working with here, it's causing delayed reaction symptoms." Lucia completed the cranial procedure and moved immediately to assess the chemical exposure patient, finding symptoms that were consistent with experimental atmospheric compounds rather than standard industrial chemicals. The respiratory distress indicated exposure to substances that were designed to interact with atmospheric chemistry in ways that could affect weather patterns over large geographic areas. What exactly were they researching here? She asked Agent Wells, who was monitoring defensive preparations while coordinating with outside support elements. Wells consulted her classified briefing materials, calculating how much information to share with someone who was technically a civilian volunteer. Atmospheric engineering on a scale that could influence weather patterns across entire regions. The potential for drought mitigation, hurricane redirection, and climate stabilization is enormous. But the same technology could be weaponized to create droughts, redirect storms toward enemy territories, or disrupt agricultural production in hostile nations, Lucia replied, recognizing the dual-use implications that made this research so valuable to multiple governments. David approached with tactical updates that made their situation even more urgent. "Hostile forces have reached the outer perimeter. We have maybe 30 minutes before they reach the main facility. Dr. Reyes, what's the status on patient evacuation?" Lucia assessed the medical condition of patients who were stable enough for transport under combat conditions versus those who still required immediate intervention. Dr. Martinez is stable but needs continuous monitoring. The burn victims are stabilized but will need specialized care during transport. 2 patients with spinal injuries can be moved if we maintain proper immobilization. Agent Wells activated emergency communication protocols that connected the facility to military support elements, whose existence wasn't acknowledged in civilian government structures. "We have extraction assets en route, but they won't arrive before hostile forces reach the facility. We need to buy time and protect both personnel and research materials." As Lucia continued treating patients whose injuries were more complex than anything she'd encountered during her military service, she realized that this mission represented the convergence of every moral dilemma that had driven her away from classified operations. The people she was trying to save were working on technology that could benefit humanity or destroy it, depending on who controlled its application. But regardless of the larger implications, these were human beings who deserved medical care without regard to the political or strategic value of their work. She'd taken an oath to save lives, and that commitment transcended whatever governments or intelligence agencies might consider important. Marcus reported communication intercepts that revealed the approaching forces were better equipped and more professional than typical criminal organizations. These aren't random hostiles looking for ransom opportunities. They're trained operatives with advanced equipment and specific objectives related to the research conducted here. Elena established firing positions that would allow the defense team to delay hostile forces while protecting the medical area, where patients were receiving treatment. "Dr. Reyes, we can hold them off for maybe an hour if we get lucky. After that, we'll need alternative evacuation plans." Lucia completed stabilization procedures for the most critical patients and began preparing them for evacuation under combat conditions, a skill set she'd hoped never to use again. The medical equipment was designed for rapid deployment and transport, But moving seriously injured patients through hostile territory would challenge every technique she'd learned during 8 years of military service. Thompson assisted with patient preparation while monitoring communication systems that provided updates on approaching hostile forces. "Dr. Reyes, we've got 15 patients who can be evacuated, but some of them won't survive transport unless we maintain hospital-level care during movement." David coordinated defensive preparations with evacuation logistics, his planning indicating experience with operations where medical objectives and tactical requirements had to be balanced against impossible odds. "Dr. Reyes, we need to move in 20 minutes. Can your patients handle transport through potentially hostile territory?" Lucia looked around the emergency shelter where 15 people depended on her medical expertise to keep them alive long enough to reach safety. Some of them were working on research that could reshape global climate management. Others were support personnel who had been in the wrong place when experimental technology had malfunctioned. All of them deserved the same level of medical care, regardless of the strategic implications of their work. "We move together," she said, beginning the process of converting a field hospital into a mobile medical unit capable of operating under combat conditions. "Everyone who can be moved will be moved. No one gets left behind." Agent Wells consulted her communication equipment and reported information that added another layer of urgency to their situation. "Dr. Reyes, intelligence indicates that hostile forces have orders to capture key personnel alive, particularly Dr. Martinez and the senior research staff. They're not just trying to steal technology. They want the people who understand how to implement it." As hostile forces approached a facility where injured people waited for evacuation that might arrive too late, Lucia realized that she was once again caught between her medical oath and circumstances that made saving lives a political act. The difference was that this time she would make her own decisions about who deserved protection and why. The storm continued to rage outside. Hostile forces were closing in, and evacuation remained uncertain. But 15 people were depending on her ability to navigate all of those challenges while maintaining the medical care that would keep them alive long enough to reach safety. Time was running out for everyone involved, and Lucia prepared to become Phoenix one more time in service of objectives that she would define for herself. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain wind like a blade through silk, their engines echoing off canyon walls in ways that suggested armored personnel carriers rather than civilian transportation. Lucia finished securing the final patient monitor to Dr. Martinez's portable life support system and activated the communication device that would maintain medical telemetry during their evacuation through terrain that was about to become a battlefield. "All patients are stable for transport," she announced to David, who was coordinating defensive positions while monitoring evacuation routes that changed by the minute as hostile forces adjusted their approach. "But we need to move now, or some of them won't survive the journey." Agent Wells emerged from the facility's command center carrying data, storage devices that represented years of atmospheric research and billions of dollars in development costs. Behind her, facility personnel destroyed computer systems and research equipment that couldn't be evacuated, their faces reflecting the particular grief of scientists watching their life's work disappear in clouds of thermite smoke. "Dr. Reyes, evacuation helicopters are inbound, but they can't land until we establish a secure perimeter," Wells said, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who'd planned for this contingency but hoped it would never be necessary. "We need to move patients to the alternate landing zone while the defense team delays hostile forces." The alternate landing zone was a cleared area 2 miles from the facility, accessible by hiking trails that would challenge healthy people in good weather and potentially kill injured patients in the current conditions. Lucia looked at the 15 people whose lives depended on her ability to provide medical care while navigating terrain that military protocols would classify as impassable. "Thompson, We're going to need mobile medical support during the evacuation. She told the paramedic, who was preparing portable equipment that would maintain life support functions during transport. Dr. Martinez and the spinal injury patients will need continuous monitoring. The burn victims will require pain management and fluid replacement. Everyone needs respiratory support in case we encounter more chemical contamination. David activated his tactical communication system and received updates that made their situation even more urgent. Hostile forces have breached the outer perimeter. We have maybe 15 minutes before they reach the main facility. Dr. Reyes, can your patients handle immediate evacuation through potentially hostile territory? Lucia assessed each patient's condition against the risks of moving them through mountain wilderness while under potential enemy fire. The medical calculations were complex, but the strategic reality was simple. Staying meant capture or death. Moving meant some chance of survival for everyone involved. We move together, we arrive together, she said, beginning the process of converting 15 critically injured patients into a mobile medical unit, capable of functioning under combat conditions. Elena, I need your people to carry the portable life support equipment. Marcus, maintain communication with the evacuation helicopters and provide medical updates. Catherine, monitor environmental conditions and warn us about terrain hazards. The evacuation began with the organized chaos that marked professional emergency operations under extreme conditions. Patients were transferred to portable stretchers equipped with medical monitoring systems. Life support equipment was distributed among team members who'd been trained for exactly this scenario, and everyone moved with the efficiency that came from understanding that mistakes would be measured in lives lost rather than mission delays. Dr. Martinez remained unconscious but stable, her vital signs monitored by equipment that transmitted real-time medical data to specialists who were standing by at trauma centers hundreds of miles away. The spinal injury patients were immobilized in devices that would protect them from further damage during transport through terrain that seemed designed to inflict maximum harm on anyone attempting to traverse it. As they began the 2-mile journey to the evacuation site, Lucia realized that she was leading the kind of medical evacuation that had defined her military career, moving seriously injured people through hostile territory using skills that most physicians never developed and equipment that officially didn't exist. The difference was that this time, she was making decisions based on her own medical judgment, rather than following orders from officials who viewed human lives as acceptable losses in larger strategic games. Behind them, the sound of gunfire began as David's defense team engaged hostile forces who were attempting to reach the facility before evacuation could be completed. The tactical radio carried reports that suggested the approaching enemy was well-equipped and professionally trained, confirming intelligence that this wasn't a random criminal operation, but a coordinated attempt to capture both personnel and research materials. Thompson moved alongside the patient column, monitoring vital signs and adjusting medical equipment as they navigated trails that seemed to disappear and reappear without warning. Dr. Reyes, the burn patients are showing signs of shock from the exertion. We need to increase fluid replacement and consider stronger pain management. Lucia made medication adjustments while continuing to move through forest that had been transformed by rain and wind into something alien and threatening. Trees that had stood for centuries bent and swayed in ways that suggested they might fall without warning. Streams had become torrents that required careful navigation and visibility was limited to whatever their night vision equipment could penetrate through weather that challenged the limits of human endurance. Patient 7 is going into respiratory distress. Elena reported from her position monitoring the chemical exposure victims. Oxygen saturation is dropping, and he's showing signs of delayed reaction to whatever compounds he was exposed to. Lucia moved to assess the patient while maintaining forward progress, her hands working automatically through diagnostic procedures that had been refined during hundreds of similar emergencies. The respiratory distress was consistent with exposure to experimental atmospheric compounds that were designed to interact with weather systems but apparently had unexpected effects on human physiology. Agent Wells, moving alongside the evacuation column while maintaining communication with outside support elements, provided updates that explained the urgency surrounding their mission. Dr. Reyes, the atmospheric manipulation technology developed at this facility, represents a breakthrough in weather engineering. The potential applications for drought prevention, hurricane mitigation, and climate stabilization could benefit millions of people. But the same technology could be weaponized to create targeted droughts, redirect storms toward enemy populations, or disrupt agricultural production in hostile nations, Lucia replied, understanding the dual-use implications that made this research so valuable to multiple governments. The people trying to capture us want the technology for offensive applications. David's voice crackled through the tactical radio with updates from the defense team that was buying time for their evacuation. Hostile forces have reached the main facility. They're conducting systematic searches, looking for personnel and equipment. Dr. Reyes, what's your estimated arrival time at the evacuation site? Lucia assessed their progress against the medical requirements of patients who were being pushed beyond the limits of safe transport. They'd covered approximately half the distance to the landing zone, but the most difficult terrain lay ahead, and several patients were showing signs of deterioration that would require immediate intervention. 45 minutes if we maintain current pace, but I may need to stop for emergency medical procedures if patients destabilize further, she transmitted, adjusting medication dosages for patients whose conditions were being complicated by exertion, altitude, and exposure to environmental hazards. Marcus received communication from the evacuation helicopters that were standing by to extract the medical team and their patients. Medical flight is inbound, estimated arrival at the landing zone in 30 minutes. They're equipped for trauma transport and have medical specialists standing by to continue care during flight to trauma centers. The sound of helicopter rotors became audible over the wind, distinctive aircraft signatures that suggested military medical evacuation capabilities rather than civilian emergency services. Lucia recognized the sound patterns from her years as a combat medic pilot, understanding that the evacuation assets were equipped with hospital-level medical facilities that could maintain care for critically injured patients during transport to definitive treatment facilities. As they approached the landing zone, a cleared area that was barely large enough for helicopter operations in ideal conditions, the weather began to show signs of temporary improvement. Wind speeds decreased slightly, visibility increased enough to permit safe aircraft operations, and the rain shifted from torrential downpour to heavy but manageable precipitation. Landing zone in sight, Catherine reported, her weather monitoring equipment indicating that they had perhaps 30 minutes of conditions that would permit helicopter evacuation before the storm intensified again. We have a window, but it's closing fast. The evacuation helicopters appeared through the clouds like mechanical angels, their rotors cutting through weather that should have grounded all aircraft. The lead aircraft was configured for medical transport, equipped with life support systems that would maintain care for critical patients during flight to trauma centers. The second helicopter carried security personnel who would provide protection during the evacuation and ensure that no one was left behind. Lucia coordinated the transfer of patients from portable life support systems to aircraft medical facilities, each movement requiring precision that could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Martinez was loaded first, her neurological status stable but requiring continuous monitoring during transport. The burn victims followed, their care transferred to specialists who were equipped to handle chemical exposure injuries that were beyond the scope of typical trauma medicine. All patients loaded and stable for transport, she reported to the flight medical team, which included specialists who understood both conventional trauma care and the unique challenges associated with experimental chemical exposure. Dr. Martinez needs immediate neurosurgical consultation. The burn patients require specialized wound care, and everyone needs monitoring for delayed effects from atmospheric compound exposure. As the helicopters lifted off into weather that was rapidly deteriorating again, Lucia found herself in the familiar position of providing medical care while aircraft systems fought against conditions that challenged the limits of safe flight operations. Through the aircraft windows, she could see the research facility in the distance, its buildings dark except for the glow of fires that marked the destruction of technology that multiple governments had considered worth fighting for. Agent Wells, seated across from her in the medical helicopter, activated her communication equipment and began coordinating with agencies that would investigate the incident, assess the damage to national security interests, and determine what could be salvaged from research programs that had taken decades to develop. Dr. Reyes, the atmospheric engineering technology may be lost, but the people who understand its implementation are safe, Wells said, her voice carrying relief that came from completing a mission where success had been measured in lives saved, rather than strategic objectives achieved. Dr. Martinez and her team can rebuild their research, and the knowledge they possess can't be replicated by hostile forces who might have captured the facilities. 3 hours later, as medical helicopters landed at trauma centers, where specialists were standing by to continue care for patients who had survived evacuation under impossible conditions, Lucia realized that she had completed the kind of mission that had once defined her identity as Phoenix. The difference was that this time, she had made decisions based on her own moral authority, rather than following orders from officials who viewed human lives as resources to be expended in service of larger objectives. Dr. Martinez regained consciousness. In the neurosurgical intensive care unit, her first words a question about the safety of her research team and the status of atmospheric engineering, projects that could benefit humanity if they remained in the right hands. The burn victims were receiving specialized care that would restore their health and allow them to continue work that could revolutionize weather prediction and climate management. Everyone who had been evacuated from the research facility would recover completely and return to projects that could reshape the relationship between human civilization and environmental challenges. 6 months later, Dr. Lucia Reyes returned to Riverside Falls, where the clinic waited exactly as she had left it, complete with coffee cups that needed washing and appointment schedules that needed updating. The people of the small mountain town welcomed her back, without questions about where she had been or why she had disappeared for several days during the worst storm in local memory. But her absence had been noted by people who understood the value of physicians with her particular combination of skills and moral authority. Letters began arriving from humanitarian organizations that needed medical professionals capable of working in challenging environments, research institutions that required physicians who understood the complexities of experimental medicine, and government agencies that were developing programs designed to protect people rather than exploit them. Agent Wells visited the clinic on a quiet Tuesday morning, carrying coffee and an offer that represented everything Lucia had once walked away from, but approached from a completely different direction. The position involved coordinating medical support for research programs that were designed to benefit humanity, working with teams that prioritized human welfare over strategic objectives, and maintaining the kind of medical authority that would prevent good people from being sacrificed for political convenience. Dr. Reyes, we're establishing a new program for atmospheric research that includes medical oversight from the beginning, rather than treating physician input as an afterthought. Wells explained, her proposal representing the kind of integration between medical ethics and scientific advancement that Lucia had always believed was possible. We need someone who understands both advanced medicine and the complexities of working with technology that could reshape the world. Lucia looked around the clinic that had been her sanctuary for 8 years, then out the window at the mountain community that had accepted her without conditions or questions. The choice wasn't between her old life and her new identity anymore. It was between remaining safely hidden in a small town where she could help individuals one at a time, or returning to work that could affect the lives of millions of people, while maintaining the ethical standards that defined her sense of purpose. "I'll consider your offer," she said, understanding that the decision would determine not just her own future, but the direction of research programs that could benefit humanity if they remained guided by moral authority rather than strategic convenience. "But any position I accept will be on my terms, with medical ethics taking priority over political objectives." As Agent Wells left the clinic carrying Lucia's conditions for potential cooperation with atmospheric research programs that prioritized human welfare, the afternoon mail brought a letter that would influence her decision in ways that government offers could not. The envelope contained a photograph of Dr. Sarah Martinez standing with her research team at a new facility designed specifically for beneficial atmospheric engineering, and a handwritten note that reads simply, "Thank you for giving us the chance to continue work that could help millions of people. The world needs more physicians who understand that saving lives is always the right choice." Lucia placed the photograph on her desk next to pictures of the children she delivered in Riverside Falls, understanding that her choice was no longer between hiding and serving, but between different ways of fulfilling the oath she'd taken to protect human life and well-being. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.